Welcome, everyone. For those of us who were in the previous session, one of the things that we talked about was the importance of digital infrastructure and very similar concept, digital public infrastructure. And thinking about the importance of digital infrastructure, public and otherwise, as a key component shaping the future of the digital economy. And so this session is going to take a deeper dive into how we can think about digital infrastructure, in particular the role that policy and governance can play in shaping the design, implementation, and capacity of digital infrastructure to create a more dynamic digital economy overall. And so I'm joined by a very esteemed panel here. Laura Halenius from Sitra in Finland, Yash Kalash from CG, and Christian Kastrop from the Global Solutions Initiative. But also online we have my colleague Nicole from Project Liberty Institute and Vidisha Mishra from the Global Solutions Initiative. So thank you all who are online and in person here in attendance. This is meant to be, in theory, a roundtable, but we are on stage. You are sitting in the audience or you're online. If there are questions and comments as we get to the discussion period, feel free to raise your hand. I will try to acknowledge people in person. Online, you're able to submit questions, and I can see them on this iPad in front of me. And look forward to the conversation today. So just a little introduction then. Myself, working with my colleague Nicole, who's online, with Vidisha, who's online, and with Christian Kastrop. We've been together, our organization, Project Liberty Institute, and the Global Solutions Initiative, consulting on what the future of digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure can be, could be, should be, in terms of creating a more dynamic digital economy, one that respects the rights of individual citizens in terms of their data and how they make choices about their data. We've had consultations in the run-up to, on the sidelines of the Paris Peace Forum, in the run-up to the AI Action Summit. We just had a consultation in Washington, D.C., with a mixed audience of policymakers, people from civil society. It was an interesting conversation, and today we get to continue that conversation, again, trying to bring this conversation intentionally into the form of the T7 and the G7, so that we can think about this internationally. And I think today, if I were to have one request, it would be for us collectively to think about digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure from that international perspective. So quickly, I want to give Christian a chance to say hello as well, and then we'll get to our panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Jeb, for the input, and I guess most important things already been said, but just to remind some issues, of course, G7 countries also are part of G20 countries, and of course we also now include already the African Union, as well as we also discussed in an earlier panel, the European Union. And of course, if we look into that, both of these groups already adopted UN-led processes like the Global Digital Compact, so which is relatively close to this digital infrastructure solutions to advanced data agency already. And of course, let me also just say that given the pace and the scale, of course, of digital innovation, and of course also different contexts and issues within the G20, also between the G20, I think would of course also be very nice to have a global consensus building on data governance standards, but it cannot happen easily also. So, but as a group of industrialized AI hubs, of course the G7 can nevertheless leverage, I think, collective influence to promote frameworks that in the end could strengthen data agency, establish continuous multi-stakeholder dialogue, and last but not least also set standards for seamless data exchange, encourage also fair competition. And of course, it could, in the end, also nurture open digital ecosystems, also to advance positive innovation. This is an aspect for industry, but it's also a very important aspect for civil society organizations and also, say, the people as such. So we are excited to have this here at the T7 summit. And back to Jeb.
So without further ado, I want to turn it over to my colleagues on the panel here. First, Yash, Kalash, as chairs of the task force on digitalization, a T7 task force on digitalization of the global economy, and your ongoing role as research director of digital economy, curious about how you would frame up this conversation for us today.
Yeah, thanks, Jeb. So I'm going to start with maybe framing some of our thoughts around what's happened in the task forces and around this T7 process. So first, let me express my thanks to the Global Solution Initiative and Project Liberty for convening this important session on this very important topic and for allowing me this opportunity to speak about some of our learnings from the task force. So I think at this critical moment, one truth is becoming undeniable, that digital infrastructure is not just a technological concern. It's a question of sovereignty, equity, and democratic legitimacy across all societies. How we design, govern, and distribute our digital infrastructure determines who holds power, who benefits from the innovation, and most importantly, who gets left out. Across the body of work, the policy briefs that we received, one theme was very clear and kept recurring, which was the structure of digital infrastructure will determine the distribution of power. And that structure, to me, and I think to our task force largely, it seems pretty imbalanced today. It's largely centralized, built on proprietary standards, and increasingly dominated by a small number of platforms and jurisdictions. And this model, whilst once was very important for the propagation and growth of digital technologies, today it's morphed into a very extractive and exclusionary and rather geopolitically unstable model. And I think the G7 cannot approach this today as a marginally regulatory issue. It needs to be understood as a more core economic and geopolitical challenge of our times. And what I'll do now is probably frame a couple of challenges that we saw and that demand urgent attention from the G7 and policymakers across the world. The first one was fragmentation of governance and infrastructure. So what we're seeing is rising regulatory divergence, incompatible standards, and technological silos that obstruct interoperability and increase compliance burdens, especially for medium to small enterprises and in developing economies. We're seeing an erosion of public trust, with citizens are increasingly disillusioned with digital systems due to their opaque data practices, lack of control, and growing surveillance, both state and corporate. And we think without legitimacy, technical solutions will have a difficult time in scaling. And third, we're seeing concentration of power. So we're seeing a disproportionate influence of private actors in shaping digital norms and ecosystems, in distorting innovation, reinforcing dependency, and creating silos again, and overall weakening the role of democratic oversight in this technological development. Another key issue that we've seen is geopolitical instability and ideological divergence. We're seeing as strategic competition intensifies, rival digital governance models proliferate. Existing multilateral mechanisms are struggling to keep pace with this and leaving more room for fragmentation. But all of this said, there's not all doom. There is some opportunity here for the G7. And I think in shaping this new foundation for a digital economy for tomorrow, what we're looking at is focusing on embedding data agency and trust into the architecture of the digital infrastructure from the outset itself. So not retrofitting privacy protections when the harm has occurred. And I think having that individual agency of people as a design principle is very important in designing any kind of digital public infrastructure. The second is really clear interoperable standards and taxonomies that reduce regulatory fragmentation, advance balance of digital sovereignty and openness and mutual recognition, really building upon the principles of DFFT that we've seen come out of the G20. And third is supporting the development of inclusive and accountable governance models. So this includes not only multi-stakeholder oversight, but investment in capacity building, particularly for governments in the global south, for MSMEs, and I think this is a very important role for the G7 to play here. And something we've discussed heavily in our T7 task force discussions. And finally, I think perhaps most fundamentally for the G7 is to champion that these digital systems of today are public goods and they're important for the global. It's a global common. And it's not really just about concentration of power by one particular entity or a nation or corporate interest. So I'll end my remarks there, and thank you.
Thank you, Yash. A lot to think about there in terms of how you framed up both the challenges and the opportunities. I would just note, again, for those of us who were part of the previous session, this idea of balance or imbalance coming up again and again across multiple dimensions as one of the challenges, but perhaps an opportunity. You mentioned data agency, you mentioned trust. This is an important thing that's come up, and I agree is something we need to grapple with. Laura Halenius, as project director focused on data and competitiveness at Sitra, I know you've been thinking about these and other issues for a long time. So how would you want us to think, in addition to what Yash has said, about the conversation we're having today about digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure?
Thank you. Coming from a Nordic country, which is powered by trust, I see that the public sector has a role to play building these kind of digital infrastructures. And in this geopolitical situation, when Trump is seeing European fines against the big tech companies as tariffs, and has said that he is going to limit our access to those big tech services, we have to, make sure that we have our own sovereign infrastructure for the digital services. And we have been doing that for a long time in Finland. And together, because we are a small country, we have been doing together, for example, with Estonia, X-Road, which is cybersecurity safe infrastructure exchanging data. And that is open source, free for you to use, and it has also been scaled to Latin American countries. But the infrastructure doesn't matter if you don't have the services that power people. And in Finland, we have taken the live event approach. So whenever you have a live event, like your child is born, or somebody from your family dies, or your child goes to school, there are a lot of bureaucracy around it. And we have to now focus on services that actually empowers people and helps them in their daily life. One of the good examples of this is the automation of taxation in Finland. So I don't have to do anything. I just get, proposal from the Finnish tax authorization office, and if I'm okay with it, so zero time for me to waste doing my taxes. And the second thing is we also have in Helsinki, where I'm from, when your child goes to school, you get a text message which says which school your child is going. So no bureaucracy there, and the families are really happy. So we already have these kind of services, but still we are lacking some part of the infrastructures, even in Finland. One of them being, if I want to interact with the public services, I'm doing that with my bank credentials. So my identity, my digital identity depends about my relations with my bank. And that is unbearable. It's the same thing that we would use like Walmart loyalty cards as identity cards. And I think we should do better in Finland. And now at the European level, we have this so-called EID and eIDAS regulation, which allows us to have a sovereign identity and sovereign way of identifying identifying ourselves in digital world. And the digital identity, and it's monopolized by the big giants at the moment. And I think this is the key component in these geopolitical times. We should have like a real choices for people. We shouldn't be so dependent on the big tech in this part of the infrastructure.
Thank you, Laura, very much. Interesting to think about Finland being so far along the path in some areas, and other areas still looking for those innovations, especially around identity that's not tied to a private sector entity. And, you know, I think with your comments, I would just share with the audience that we at Project Liberty Institute specifically are very much motivated by exploring what is possible in terms of decentralized digital infrastructure, meaning that we need credentials that are respected and honored by government, by private sector, but could there be a model in which this doesn't depend or is wholly determined by a government entity, that really there is power at the individual level. So just wanted to raise that. In fact, it's a perfect segue to my colleague, Sarah Nicole, who's online. And I told our last group that were online, Sarah and Vidisha, that you are 3 times the height of the people on stage. So people can see you loudly and clearly, and hopefully they can hear you equally well. So Sarah, over to you to talk a little bit more about precisely what we're doing in this particular project on digital infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Jeb. Hello, everyone. Very glad to be online. If I have any connectivity issue while delivering those remarks, I think this will only further prove our points as well that we need better digital infrastructure. So let me dive right in. In collaboration with the Global Solutions Initiative, we have published this report that highlights how value is distributed across the global digital economy and how it is largely influenced by digital infrastructure solutions, and especially the role government plays in shaping it. However, today, most of the world's digital infrastructure solutions are owned by private companies, especially by only a few monopolies. And this impacts the competition, the growth, and innovation, as Yash and Laura just stated a moment ago. And as Jeb said, so this report was the result of a multi-stakeholder consultations, one in Paris and one in DC, with over 60 experts that join us into thinking about all this. And we have turned part of this report into concrete recommendation, which is now, and we're happy about it, it's now a T7 policy brief that you can find on the CG and Think7 website. So let me give you some key insight from this report to take the conversation with the audience further. For decades, the role of governments in driving innovation has been deprioritized, leading to mostly reactive regulatory approaches, which today prove its limits. In the early days of the internet, governments were highly involved, bringing tons of funding, and were parts of all these discussions. And then their involvement has been very limited. And today, the tendency is that they are either trying to catch up, playing the game of regulating ex post, basically once the harm is done, and we talked about the situation today, or they adopt a very laissez-faire position. And you can see this with the development of AI, which today is 100% led by private actor. And in parallel, the trust in democratic government is highly undermined, while the spread of online disinformation is at its highest in an overall uncontrolled online spaces where citizens spend an average of 6.5 hours a day. And although it seems that government over the world this last year, and especially these last months, have started to look back at this question of technology and innovation more seriously, especially through the lens of digital sovereignty and especially the concerns around digital sovereignty. This digital sovereignty narrative are unfortunately often misled by governments sometimes claiming to build their own internet, to be so self-sufficient and independent from the whole value chain and supply chain, that this may lead to a lot of splinternet concerns. And so arguably by getting involved again within the innovation cycle, then government will be able to understand also the technicalities better. And so we argue that governments have to prioritize digital infrastructure solution because it's a question of power. that is at the roots of the digital economy, both from a governance, but also from a technical level. Because when your connectivity only depends on private actors, often in situation of monopoly with unchecked powers, opaque way of operating, this is very risky. We can take the example of Starlink, who has been sending threats to withdraw from Ukraine at a critical time. This is absolutely not normal. You can take the example of, for instance, the African continent, where most countries in the African continent have 3 options for their connectivity. It's in the sky with Starlink, it's under the water with Google, or it's on Earth with Huawei. And because of this privatization of infrastructure, which is central to people's daily life, we're not talking abstract, we're talking about health, finances, we're talking about things that impact people on a daily basis. I think we should wonder something. Would it make sense in our analog world for people with the necessary means to be able to turn, for instance, all green lights in front of them while they are driving because they have control over this infrastructure? So the question of power is central at the government level, but also at the technical level, and it needs to be tackled in a systemic approach that only government can do. You can't expect to heal the trees by checking the leaves. You need to go to the roots of the tree. And this is the infrastructure. And here we're specifically focusing on the hardware infrastructure, such as the networks, data centers, the smart grids, and so on. And because we've seen it, right? Any platform tweak like cookies policy or privacy settings, they have not fundamentally changed the fundamental issue of data agency. And this is something that can only be tackled at the infrastructure layer. And so the final point in this report that we published, and I think there's also a few copy in person, and I hope some people can get the hard copy. It's always nice to have things in the analog world as well. To truly shift this power relationship between big tech players and citizens, data agency should be the core component of digital infrastructure design, much like what Yash was saying. There has been key legislation that have really impacted people for the good, like GDPR and DSA. But it has also not been fully able to shift the power dynamics at play. And so government must establish framework that place citizens at the center of data governance, ensuring that individual can not only opt in or opt out, but truly determine what their data is used for, is shared, or how it is monetized. And to do so, technically, they should mandate the use of open source, interoperable, this has been said, and also decentralized protocol in the very design of digital infrastructure solution. Embedding data agency in the design of digital infrastructure is not merely an issue of individual rights. It is essential for building trust in government and public services, because when citizens have meaningful control over their data, they're more likely to engage with digital services, adopt new technology, and contribute to the digital economy. So we look forward to hearing from all of you today in the room, even though I cannot see you. That's very sad. But I give back the floor to you, Jeb, to kick off the discussion, and we'll be here listening.
Thank you, Sarah. I do encourage people to take a look at the T7 policy brief that reflects a number of the points that Sarah just highlighted. The report that she also mentioned is already out and online. I don't know if we have physical copies, but I like analog too sometimes. But for today, the discussion, there's a number of ways we could go. One thing I'd like maybe to start with, and I'll turn to the panel first, but welcome questions, comments from others in the room or online, and that is, to Sarah's comments, you could think about this in a very literal, physical way, digital infrastructure, which seems essential, to me at least, but we also keep talking about things like data agency, digital public infrastructure, public services. So just to be curious to expand a little bit on the responsibility, but also the opportunity to invest in or incentivize the development of digital public infrastructure. Yash, maybe you could kick us off with some additional thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jeb. So I think there's a big difference in terms of the approaches taken by developing nations and developed and advanced economies on digital public infrastructure. And where it centers is on political purpose and national objectives. And what I mean by this is that most developing economies like India or Brazil, have taken this approach of assigning essentially concrete national objectives to the achieving of digital public infrastructure. So whether that's financial inclusion, removing inefficiencies in welfare delivery, or barriers to economic participation for MSMEs and marginalized communities, and then building out services that essentially provide solutions to those problems. And the idea has always been public sector rails, private innovation on top. That is largely the approach taken by. Whereas if you see in the advanced economies, at least in my opinion, there's a market approach to this in the US of private sectors leading development and hence concentration of power within the big tech. In Europe, there's a regulatory first approach. So let's protect. That is, in my opinion, that's been the focus. But what's missing there is public value. How do you generate public value from the DPI that you're trying to implement? Because at the end of the day, if your citizen is your customer and the center to your design principle, then it should be about them and the value they can extract, not corporates, not the government. So I think there's a divergent approach. Now, how this plays out, again, it's very much geopolitics, but yes, I think I'll...
And so what I hear you saying in part, if I understood correctly, is that for a country like India, a country like Brazil, it's not a nice to have. It's an essential component of almost like a national economic strategy. Is that fair?
It's a development goal. Yeah, for sure.
And that is in contrast to more developed economies, at least from your perspective. Laura, do you see something similar? And speaking, from your position and experience in Finland and Europe, I mean, has digital public infrastructure been an afterthought so far? And again, where in your view does the public fit? How do we think about the responsibility and opportunity to involve the public with digital infrastructure?
Okay, the concept of the digital infrastructure, it's really hard. We have the hard infrastructure, like the Sitra just said, like it's a computing power, data centers, supercomputing, and then we have the soft infrastructure. So it's a data exchange layers, AI, and the services on top of that. And we need every part of that stack to be in place in order to create value. And I have to say that as European, I'm looking to India, and I think you have done some really nice things in India. Like the India stack is a good example of an infrastructure, for payment infrastructure that actually creates also real value and real services for the citizens and benefiting also the customers. And that is the level of ambitious we should have globally when we think about the infrastructures, and the governments can push these kind of innovations. I know that the India stack it's not perfect. I have been talking with the people who have actually created that, but it's start of something really nice and something really powerful, because we usually talk about the big tech like Google, Microsoft, but we also have duopolies in financial sector like Visa and MasterCard. So why not push that kind of innovations globally? And I think G7 countries would have a real role in this game.
And so thinking about what you just said and what Yash also said, maybe to make this a bit more concrete, because there's a number of ways I would imagine, and based on our reporting and what we've heard from others, there's a number of different ways one could go about building digital public infrastructure. To your comment, Laura, the India stack's not perfect. No one expected it to be, but there's activity there. There's real investment. Things are happening, right? And I would agree that between India and Brazil, these are the most often cited examples of actual progress on digital public infrastructure at scale. So my question is, what have been the metrics, or what could or should be the metrics to tell us things are working in the way that are in service of the public? In the case of India or Brazil, whatever you might like to cite, what are the signs, indicators that, oh, that is a success story when it comes to digital public infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the biggest success story has been the financial inclusion aspect of it, in terms of the people who were underserved, who were not within the framework of the organized financial sector, have now been given access to services that they could not access before. They're actually known as people on the registry, which is a big thing in a country like India, which had technical challenges. Internet penetration was an issue. And this has allowed for creation of more customizable services, both from corporates and from the public sector, in terms of tax filing, your GST returns, etc. It's given access to real services like OCEN, which is an open network for credit enablers, gives access to, gives people access to credit, and MSMEs, who are basically the bloodline of the Indian economy, access to credit, access to more open networks and more players. So it's a more free platform. Similarly, there's been more democratization on the e-commerce area, on an initiative called ONDC. So there are a lot of examples, and I think the ONDC is in your toolkit as well, so it's cited there. So there are quite a few examples. One more focus is on specifically women. There are ongoing studies, but the fact that UPI is a mechanism for cash-based transfers and reduces potential leakages in direct cash-based transfers from public sector to marginalized communities, that is again an important concept. There are a lot of studies on micropayments and digital inclusion. So I wouldn't state all of them, but I think there is direct correlation there.
So digital payments, micro finance, these kinds of things, I'm thinking back to Kenya and other, M-Pesa and things like that. We've had examples of this for a while. I'm curious, both Laura and Yash, what has been the role of governments in promoting these opportunities? Because to build something, in the classic, movie analogy, build it and they will come. Well, is that really true? So how do you encourage people to take advantage of these newly available services so that they start to build the trust? I'm just curious what that has been like an experience. Laura, maybe start with you.
Yeah, maybe I give you an example of the infrastructure that I know quite well, which is the X Road. Of course, you can, I was on a holiday one time in Asia, and there was this really nice fountain, and somebody has, right there, we build, we don't maintain. So the role of the governments and public sector is also because we have to have the infrastructures in place, and then we have to take good care of them. So, for example, the X Road, we have built a governance model between Estonia and Finland, where it's organization who is taking care of the X Road and making sure that it's cyber secure, reliable, and usable. So making it easy to use these kind of infrastructures and investing in them is one of the keys. And because I come from Europe and we love our regulation, the second thing can be that you make it mandatory to use. For example, in Estonia, it is mandatory to use X Road in public services. So they have built a lot on top of that. In Finland, it isn't mandatory, and we have not been so successful using X Road. So, but probably not the regulation, but that's a kind of a joke. But, investing in them. And then we have one tool, which is public procurement. That's a really powerful tool. So putting these infrastructures in there and asking that please use these infrastructures when you are creating a services, public service, is one tool to scale those things.
I ask in part because Sarah and I, along with Vidisha and Christian from Global Solutions Initiatives, one of the things that we're very cognizant of is that digital infrastructure, while people in this room online might be excited about this, not everyone really thinks about this on a day-to-day basis, but they do care about the services and the quality of the services. And that's why I'm wondering, how does the word get out, so to speak? And so, Yash, I wonder what, you might point to in terms of where it has been successful, how is that becoming a story that people are telling and hearing about?
Yeah, I think fundamental to all of this is digital literacy. So educating. Especially in developing world economy settings, the fundamental difference that you've seen is one is the education efforts the public sector has put in to understand basic technologies on how to use a digital mobile. What is a digital wallet? What is a QR code? Things of that nature. Now you're seeing in India a small street vendor in a small village taking payments only online. So that evolution has happened because education has taken place over a period of time and public investment has gone into that process. There's obviously been a role for multilaterals to come in and play there. The Asian Development Bank, etc., have played an important role in partnering with states, not just in India, but in the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, to promote a lot of this growth. The second bit is the tangible benefits. When people see, they adopt. Right. So I think most street vendors, when they start seeing that, that negotiating, bartering issues as they had, connectivity issues, hard currency issues, those barriers were removed, distances were removed. That became a tangible example of real world benefit. And I think obviously, at least in the India case, one example is COVID. COVID really changed the way people thought of how payments work, how businesses happen. And if you look at the UPI statistics, the penetration rate increases by X-fold over the post-COVID period and during the COVID period. And that was a marked change in public policy perspective that, okay, this is an actual technology that we need to push because of critical infrastructure lags that have happened during COVID and that realization. So it's a combination of these three factors, I think, that really leads to deepening of DPI.
I think that's fascinating. Previous session, we heard about crisis. We heard about crisis that could lead to innovation. And so you mentioning COVID, I think is really quite important consideration. And Laura, you mentioned mandatory. I mean, we are all about choice in our philosophy. People should have a choice. But the idea that maybe there's a shock to the system, it could be not so harsh, but just a requirement, right? That says, here's the new reality. And I know there's been a bit of that in India, just moving people off previous infrastructure and just saying, this is how we're going to do things, with the promise of greater choice, actually, and greater opportunity. You mentioned the Asian Development Bank, Yash. We would be remiss in this setting of the T7, G7, not to think and consider, okay, digital infrastructure. We talked about sovereignty. Sovereignty of the individual is a value that I think we're trying to honor here and what we're talking about. We've talked a bit about national sovereignty and the importance of digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure for national economic strategy, national economic growth. Let's come back, though, to this international element. I mean, what are the advantages or the need for international cooperation? Or do we not need that? Can we live with the splinternet that Sarah mentioned earlier, that every national polity has its own digital infrastructure? Yash, you can go first.
Yeah, I think there is a case to be made that national infrastructures will be important, but the But to degree, and I guess this is a repeated recurring theme in this summit, is interoperability, right? You need systems that interact, talk to one another. Today, the world is cross-border, especially in the payment space and financial infrastructure. You need to have better infrastructure there. So that is an important place to start. A lot of the technical requirements, feasibility studies, understanding of the nuances around how this will work is a role for international bodies to play. Both in terms of the legislation and how this should work from a regulatory perspective, but also capacity building in terms of infrastructure, digital literacy, something I spoke about. So that's where a consensus mechanism like a G7 can play an important role in adding that there. And I'd say another part of it is the value system as well, in terms of the technology. How democratic is it? How open is it?
So Laura, building on that, I'm curious, we had the mention of security and national security. So maybe also to the degree that you might comment on national sovereignty, national security, how it might benefit from the interoperability that Yash was talking about.
Yes, I think living next to our lovely neighbor Russia, we are under attack every day. Our banks are under the cybersecurity attacks constantly. Our public sector services are under attack constantly. So we have to make sure that these infrastructures are really secure, but also making sure that we are connected to other infrastructures as well. If we think we are not Finland or any other country, we are not an island. So I don't think that we can have one infrastructure globally, but the interoperability is the key. And it's easiest maybe to understand thinking about people and their need for the services. One example being, for example, our medical recipes. Whenever you get sick or you lost your medicines and you have the recipe, it is so much easier to go to the pharmacy and have it there, digitally. And that is reality actually in European level. We have now the standards in place, so I can go, for example, in Estonia, Tallinn, in pharmacy and get my recipes there. And that is secure, no more, lost in translation things going on, because the pharmacist can see the recipe in their own language. And that is the power of standards and interoperability, and these kinds of things we should aim.
Thanks, Laura. Christian, you weren't expecting me to call on you, I know, but I'm just curious, because this has been an area for you professionally, this question of both national sovereignty, what's happened at the national level and international. I just wonder, in thinking about a previous conversation this morning, what additional thoughts you might have around the importance of interoperability and across borders when we think about a digital economy and how it benefits an individual state.
Yeah, I think it's a rather important question, and I do not just have a right-away answer. I think, of course, digital public infrastructure or digital infrastructure as such, I think, and this is what we just learned here, is a very, very good thing. It can help to empower people. It can also, create additional understanding between different positions. So I would also try to look a little bit of the democratic function of such a thing. Yeah, it's not just about having, nice tools which you can pay your bills or you can pay your taxes. So I would think it's also, this digital infrastructure could also help a lot empowering people, civil society, especially in a lot of countries where maybe the distance or the contact between, government and people is not that strong, yeah, even if, especially if it's distributed. So I think it's a super duper idea, what I also learned once meeting an Indian delegation in London. But I think it is really a multiple use good, and I think we should really think how we can use it. And of course, the most important thing, especially when I come to your question, Jeb, how can it also build up additional views? It could be used for also exchange of additional of different comments to certain issues. So I also see it as a people's net in a way. So where we can really also foster a global exchange against what we have just seen also in the earlier sessions, that there is always a tendency, of course, of kind of some governments, of kind of some business constructions who want just to move you in a certain political corner or into buying some things in a business corner. So I think digital infrastructure could really be a kind of an umpire where you should also check whether something you have on another digital channel could be true, false, or wrong, or just misleading, or even moving you into dangerous territory. Yeah. So I'm not talking here about the typical deep fakes or something, but I think it's also an informational instrument which can really foster digital democracy.
Thanks, Christian. I want to, Vidisha, I'm going to call on you. You've been part of this project and you've been close to some of the feedback we got in consultations. I went through our initial report very closely last night, reminding myself of some of the things we heard. One of the things that really surprised me is someone said that we already have the governance frameworks. I don't know if that's true. So maybe I need to have that put in broader context. And Venetia, if we're talking about digital infrastructure and data agency, governance seems to be important. Well, what are some of the key things that you would want to highlight for us, the panel, for our audience, from what we've heard so far about that combination of the actual infrastructure in a physical way with the governance part?
Thank you so much, Jeb, and a big hello to all of our colleagues and friends at CG there. Thank you so much for platforming this discussion. Jeb, thank you to you for all of these great questions. This valuable feedback goes into the toolkit. So, one of the things to address your question, one of the things that really struck both Sarah and I, since we launched the project, our first consultation, which you refer to, which was in Paris, the overall tone was a lot more optimistic, I have to say. Over the last few months, the world has changed quite significantly. And so the idea of we have the raw material, we have the governance frameworks, we just have to tweak them a little bit to make data agency embedded in digital infrastructure by design. That idea it does not stand anymore. It's very clear over the last few consultations, particularly the last one that we had in DC, that questions of national security and digital infrastructure are inherently interlinked, and we can't silo those conversations. So the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of it all does need to be something that we have to think about more deeply when we think about digital infrastructure solutions in general, what that means for data agency, what that means for digital sovereignty, and so on and so forth. I've been listening to this conversation. I'll just mention a few things that stood out to me. So one, I think it's good to know, at least in this room and in this panel, there's consensus that data drives economic and social power in the digital age, and there is an issue of concentration of power that we're looking at right now. I'm very happy to hear from Yash that many of the policy briefs and many of the recommendations of the task force for the T7 this year do address this point. It's also good to know that there's recognition of the fact that digital infrastructure solutions and digital public infrastructure mean different things in different contexts. So there are converging issues between the G7 economies and the G20 economies, but there are also some divergences, and we have to address these divergences with consideration of different realities. So the trade-offs that we often think of, openness versus closed systems or privacy versus security and things like that, we have to take into account different country realities. And I'm very happy to hear some specific examples also from the panel today on some of those things. I do want to sort of bring the conversation a little bit to the question of governance frameworks. So the T7, I've been looking at some of the policy briefs that have come out. There's an immense amount of evidence, and there are some really solid policy proposals for the G7 countries. But the topic that we're addressing is so broad and so international that we have to find interlinkages with what's happening at the G20 level as well. So I'd like to make sure that the conversations that we're having right now, they do get channeled to the G20 processes as well, whether that is through the G7 itself, which they're members of the G20, whether that is through the European Union, which has a common membership between the G7 and the G20. We have to have some of these conversations and really unpack what these trade-offs mean, what are the different elements that we have to have in place for data agency to be embedded in digital infrastructure, keeping in mind the different realities and contexts that we're looking at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, and as Sarah was saying, a lot of the feedback that we've gathered from conversations like this and some of the consultations that we've had so far will go into building this toolkit, which we hope we can socialize, because we realize that realities are changing so quickly. Any kind of toolkit that we have in place is not going to be relevant and not appeal to all stakeholder groups till we really get a chance to socialize it. There was a question from the virtual audience here about the different models that different organizations, civil society organizations included, are putting in place to really empower citizens and give them data ownership. So for instance, one of our partners at Radical Exchange are working on new forms of architecture, such as trusted data intermediaries. So it would be good to also have these examples and really see what these mean moving forward for a larger context. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vidisha. I think, and there's a number of things you said and a number of things that have been discussed by the panel that I would highlight too as we get near time. One is the emphasis on reality. I think what's one of the brilliant advantages of being in this context, the T7 and G7, is thinking about how is this operationalized in this group of governments that are traditionally, historically aligned on values. And I have to say, a group that has a unique set of challenges now in the world. But that reality is important, so that we shouldn't only talk about principles. And I really appreciate the panel today, Yash and Laura in particular, explaining what they're talking about and what they think works and what could work based on empirical experience, whether it's in India, Brazil, Finland. I mean, grounding ourselves in reality, I think, is essential to Vidisha's point. The whole principle that Sarah and I, as colleagues at Project Liberty, working with Vidisha and Christian and the team at Global Solutions Initiative, the whole principle that we're trying to honor and develop is agility of governance. And that's not easily done. But there's potentially something about infrastructure level intervention by governments that positions governments to exercise governance in a more agile way. By that I mean, rather than trying to come up with perfect solutions in advance of technologies that don't exist, or scrambling to catch up with the latest technologies that are often at a relatively high level of the technology stack because they're directly serving users, what about that infrastructure? How to design the infrastructure so that not only does it embed certain technical capacities, but actually reflects values and requires certain things of what is built on top of that infrastructure. So agility could actually be something that is assisted by investment in digital infrastructure. And then the other term that keeps coming up is sovereignty, as well as security, but I'll focus on sovereignty now. The sovereignty of the individual, the sovereignty of the nation state, and the sovereignty of whatever entity is out there. Where does that sovereignty reside, and where should it reside, and how do these different senses of sovereignty work? And I just, this phrase came to me. I don't know if it's helpful, but I'm going to put it out there. What if we think about it in terms of stacked sovereignty? So that we have a tech stack, we have a sovereignty stack. And of course, this won't resolve everything, but if we think creatively about how we address sovereignty in these different levels and think about how they interact with the stack, so that to the point that Vidisha was raising with the practical example of radical exchange, it might not be the case, and we shouldn't be so idealistic to think every individual is going to be equally capable, no matter the level of data literacy they have, to exercise their rights, but they should have the rights. And then how do we help them exercise those rights through data intermediaries and other ways? That becomes part of this stacked sovereignty as well, maybe. So to conclude, I think if you think about reality, we have real world examples of things being done. We are not without practical case studies to draw on. I think we collectively, and especially on this particular project, want to see more real-world case studies developed and learn from those, but also keep a focus on the issue of values, principles, rights as a real key framing of where we're headed, so that there are standards guiding the development of digital infrastructure. So today is just one more stop on our road of consultation. We'll be developing a fuller report that will be debuting, at least in part, at the Global Solutions Initiative Summit in May in Berlin. And we're not going to stop there, because I don't think this will easily be resolved. But I think it's critical, and I think we're at a critical moment again. So thank you, everyone, for participating today. Really appreciate it. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to my colleagues online. And have a wonderful day. Thanks.